coming. They'll come in quietly and take seats. We're live streaming tonight, and we're also videotaping. So those folks who can't get to the meeting because of prior commitments will be able to watch it on YouTube. My name is Lee DeMontenay, and my allergies are driving me crazy. I was born and raised in Virginia, Blacksburg to be exact, even though I don't sound like it. In 2020, after almost 50 years, my husband and I decided to talk my husband into coming back to Virginia. And we intentionally chose Southwest Virginia for the quiet beauty of the Appalachian Mountains. Imagine my surprise a few weeks ago when I discovered that Virginia leads the state, that leads the nation in data centers with a whopping 665 operational data centers in our state. Texas has 400 and something. California's third with 300. We are the highest. That's the bad news. The good news is in Virginia, support for data centers has collapsed from 69% 3 years ago to 35% current. Prince William County officially abandoned the Digital Gateway, a massive 2,100-acre, 37-building campus that was set to be one of the world's largest data center developments. A $1 billion plan, 550-acre data center east of Richmond was shelved in August of 2025. And nearly 50% of U.S. data centers planned for 2026 have either been scrapped or delayed. Now, let's meet our presenters. Two of our presenters have arrived. We're waiting for the third one. He should be here shortly. Sharon?
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? As Leah said, there is growing and wide resistance to data centers across Virginia and the country, especially from rural communities. Among the coal counties in Southwest Virginia, Wise County has become the center of proposals, plans, and especially funding. The information I am presenting has been compiled from press releases, news articles, websites, and lots of research. There are gaps in what we know, as the main issue is lack of transparency. So there are 2 locations in Wise County where data center developments appear to be going on. I'm going to use my pointer here just for a moment, see if you can see it. Here and here. Here in the western part area, which is bordering the eastern Kentucky coal counties, this is the location in what is being called Data Center Ridge. How many have heard of Data Center Ridge? Only a few of you. Okay. And in the area I pointed to, right almost in the center, okay, that is a heavily populated area. It's the Lonesome Pine Regional Business and Technology Park. And the Mineral Gap Data Center is located there now. And it currently is the only data center in Wise County. Now, data centers have created 3 issues and concerns for residents: land, water, and energy. This kind of says it all. 78% of the land in Wise County has large absentee land ownership, paying 13% of the taxes. By the way, this data is being compiled by the University of Kentucky. The largest outside landowners are Penn, Virginia, the United States Forest Service, and the Nature Conservancy's Cumberland Forest Project. Wise County's IDA, Industrial Development Authority, has said that they only have access for development to 4% of the land in the county, which also means there's not land available for residents, businesses to also access. This is definitely an issue for reform. Now, this is the western part of the county, okay? And it is here in the western part where Data Center Ridge is supposedly to be located. It's on 65,000 acres that are owned by a company called Energy Transfer. They're a natural gas and pipeline company in Texas, and this land is managed by the Penn, Virginia operating company. So sometimes you hear Energy Transfer, sometimes Penn, Virginia. They're both associated with that land. Penn, Virginia, how many have heard of Penn, Virginia? Yeah, I figured that, more than Data Center Ridge. Long-time historical landowner in all of Appalachia, because that company owns 250,000 acres in West Virginia, Kentucky, and Virginia. Now, in 2023, the governor of Virginia announced a big deal, wherein an agreement would be made between Wise County, Penn, Virginia, and Energy Delta to develop land on these 65,000 acres. Using a FOIA request, we found that the agreement no longer exists as Energy Transfer has pulled out of the big deal. And we have no more information about that. Now, Energy Delta. Who or what is Energy Delta? In 2019, Virginia created the Southwest Virginia Energy Research and Development Authority. Everything's on names. Its chair has and may still be a coal baron. By the way, a New York Times article focused recently on how coal barons still greatly influence our local economies, whether it's through casinos, landfills, or data centers and nuclear energy. The Research and Development Authority then set up Delta, Energy Delta, as a nonprofit. And I'm sorry about that. Should have moved my hands. They set it up as a nonprofit, but now when you go to the website, that operation says it is a private entity. Again, lots of questions come to mind that we don't have answers for. Now, there are two advisors, managers for the authority and Delta, and each one of them set up their own private consulting firm as soon as they came on board to work with public monies. This, by the way, is a schematic that they have had on their website for several years. This is what supposedly Data Center Ridge is going to look like. But we're not ever talking about one data center. We're talking about clusters of data centers. How many of you have been or out to see Mineral Gap Data Center? A few of you have. Well, this is a drawing of Mineral Gap Data Center, and it's located on Airport Road outside of the town of Wise. It too is located in the Lonesome Pine Regional Business and Technology Park. Now, if you will notice there on the back, you see the building and then you see smaller, looks like buildings. That's a line of diesel generators. Diesel generators are backup power for data centers, which also gets its electricity from the grid. That's where we all get our electricity, and that's a major issue. And there are solar panels there. This rendition does not show that the data center is across the road from the Wise Christian School, and beside it is a call center. By the way, call centers are not data centers. It is documented that diesel generators pollute the air. Now, just down the road, this is still going to be part of the Lonesome Pine Regional Business and Technology Park, is the proposed Elam Farm Data Center Complex. Now, this is a picture before it was developed. The Elam farmland is on a former mine site and is now shovel-ready for constructing data centers, having been reclaimed with federal dollars called AMLR funds, which specifically are to work with reclaimed mine land. The plan is to build a data center complex with 9 data centers here, with energy provided by on-site natural gas-fired generation. Now, this will be what is called behind-the-meter energy source, serving only data centers, not the residents of Wise County. So again, a gas plant just to serve the data centers. By the way, natural gas generation is another pollutant. Now, water for the data centers here at Elam Farm, we have been told from authority that it will be the town of Wise reservoir with backup from water from the county's Public Service Authority, the PSA. Now, 2 companies, Red Post Energy, another an oil and gas company in Texas, that's where Energy Transfer is, and Wise Innovation Hub, a data center developer in Northern Virginia. So Red Post Energy, gas company, Wise Innovation Hub, it's interesting they did the Wise, a data center developer. And they have signed an agreement to design the gas plant infrastructure. Now, Wise County's IDA director says Red Post is the most environmentally conscious company he has encountered. By the way, Red Post formed a year ago. It's a brand new company.
Jeez.
So I will admit that it galled me a bit when I read the CEO of Red Post say about construction here, it's just hills and dirt. As with all data centers, they come with promises of jobs and revenues. So let's follow the money. In the past few years, millions of dollars, you see the figure there? Getting close to $25 million that we have documented. There could be more. Millions of dollars for developing data centers and SMRs. Who's heard of SMRs? Okay. These are called small modular nuclear reactors. And these dollars are to develop those and other forms of energy. And the money primarily comes from federal government, AMLR funds, I've mentioned the Department of Energy, and state funds like the Virginia Department of Energy, and under that is called the Virginia Clean Energy Innovation Bank. And then regional money, the Tobacco Commission, most people have heard of the Tobacco Commission, set up 30-some years ago as a settlement. Go Virginia Region 1 and VCEDA. VCEDA, most people, again, around here may have heard of. It's the Virginia Virginia Coalfield Economic Development Authority. I've got an extra E in there. And those are more regional, local funding that has been provided. Now, I want to clarify this. These dollars are not Wise County government revenues. Now, Wise County is in a financial crisis. The Board of Supervisors have been spending more than they are collecting. But these millions of dollars have been directed for what some people have called speculative projects. Little has been accomplished, something you can see, over the past 7 years, except for some site developments on formerly mined land and studies. Consultants love studies. I have a data background. I love studies too. But we'll look at some of the studies here. So let me mention a few of the expenditures. Project Oasis laid out a plan in 2020 to market data centers to coal fields using abandoned mine land and using water from abandoned mines. So in 2023, it was actually about 6 months later. That was 2020. In 2023, the SMR site feasibility study identified 7 locations, but not located on isolated land, far from populated areas as had been first hyped, but in areas near residents, schools, churches, and businesses. One of those 7 sites was located near Red Onion Prison. And in that study, they mentioned you probably might want an evacuation plan should it come to that. Then in 2024, there was an SMR supply chain study looking to see if the coal fields could be part of creating supplying parts when SMRs are finally operative. The head of Virginia's nuclear lobby said last month, Gina and I were there, that SMRs would not be commercially available until 2033. When this first started, we heard 10 years out. There are no operating SMRs in the country. Then in 2025, and continuing now into 26, a microreactor study is underway. Now, how many of you know what a microreactor is? See, okay. Microreactors are smaller than small modular. Okay. Now, these are all expenditures. Part of that, almost 25 million, are given to do all these studies and things. This past December, the UVA College of Wise was awarded $275,000 to purchase a nuclear reactor control simulator, and it's not for gaming. The stated purpose was to train workers. The college does not have a nuclear program or faculty in this field, but the college administration has been involved in funding the 3 studies I have mentioned. Now, in January of this year, Congressman Griffith announced $1.4 million to go to Energy Delta to explore the potential for advanced nuclear reactors on former coal mine lands and the effects that they have of using water to cool uh, nuclear reactors. Now, I want to say here, you're hearing a lot about SMRs right now. I want to say here, the reason our grassroots movement, which is now 3.5 years old, is called Southwest Virginia Nuclear Watch, is because residents were shocked to hear the governor say in 2022 that he wanted the first SMR, maybe in the world, to be in the coal fields. But then as we started looking into it and doing our research, we learned it was all about data centers and much more. So SMRs would eventually, it's proposed, to be the energy source for a nuclear reactors here. Now, both federal and state funds have awarded millions of dollars to study blue hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. How many have heard of those? Okay, a few of you have. To create energy from blue hydrogen, you need natural gas. And to transport captured carbon, you either need to truck it or build pipelines. We don't have it here tonight, but the Virginia Department of Energy a couple of years ago put out a map, and it showed a proposed hydrogen hub and a carbon capture and storage facility in what appears to be the Blackwood Industrial Park area between Norton and Appalachia. And the Wise County IDA has just purchased 23 more acres in that park, by the way, funded by VCTA. Now, data centers come with promises of tax revenues and jobs. We hear that. Some of the job numbers thrown at us have been exorbitant, like over 1,600. Some come with short-term construction jobs. These are jobs, and they are, but they're short-term to construct data centers. But very few jobs are permanent or full-time. 7 of us met with Senator Killian last week, and we were discussing these different issues. And he even said, nah, most of the jobs are in construction. The IDA director has said the jobs that he would expect here would mostly be security, maintenance, and some trades, but few, if any, high-paying, high-tech jobs. And that's from our IDA director. Now, we're talking about funding here. Wise County and the surrounding Cole counties have set an equipment tax on data centers at 24 cents per $100 assessed, and bragged that it is the lowest tax rate in the state. This compares to Loudoun County, very northern Virginia, which has collected more than $4 per 100 assessed, 24 cents versus $4. Loudoun County already has around 200 data centers. And believe me, this has become very controversial in Northern Virginia, where most of the current data centers are located. In fact, Loudoun County is called Data Center Alley. The reasoning for the low tax rate is it would draw data centers here. Got a real low tax rate. However, we were originally told by authority that that hasn't proven to be true. That data centers really wouldn't come here for that particular equipment tax rate. So it would be basically lost revenue for the county. Now, you probably can't read this, It's a long list. This is what we, the people, are up against. This is a list of agencies and organizations made up of politicians and special interests. The one at the very top, the Virginia Nuclear Energy Consortium, is a statewide nuclear lobby organization. And the bottom one, Data Center Coalition, is a nationwide association for data center lobbying. But then we can go, I had Governor Youngkin's administration, because at the time we put this together, much, but not all, of this had happened under former Governor Youngkin. Now, will the new administration be any different? So on here, you start with the governor's office, the Department of Energy, that Virginia Clean Energy Innovation Bank, which was one of the funders down here. There was a thing, this is rather new, the Virginia Innovative Nuclear Hub. All our politicians are two national senators, Warner, Kane, our Congressman Griffith, and almost all of our Southwest Virginia delegates and senators are for data centers and nuclear. Then you have our planning, Middle West Belt Planning District, the Wise County Board of Supervisors, the Southwest Virginia Research and Development Authority, I mentioned earlier, Energy Delta, a marketing firm called Invest Virginia, which was set up by the Tobacco Commission. I can't find anything about that right now. I don't know where that is. Mountain Empire Community College, the UVA College at Wise, have been involved in promoting nuclear and data centers. Then we have Coalfield Strategies and Virginia Energy Strategies. Those are two private consulting firms that I mentioned earlier, and they are the advisors and managers that are really, all of their work is over in the Data Center Ridge area. Go Virginia Region 1, funding, Tobacco Commission funding, VCTA funding, and again, these are all the entities that we are up against. So I mentioned, will the current administration be any different? Right now, Virginia's new budget is in dispute. Now you're going to hear different numbers. They were saying $1.9 billion, not millions now, but $1 billion are the total tax exemption giveaway for data centers in Virginia right now. And it is growing each year as new data centers are being incentivized to come here. Now, where this is, and it's happening, the General Assembly is supposed to get back together tomorrow and then made on the 23rd. When our meeting with Senator Killian, he thought it would be June 30th before it would settle. So we'll see if that is true or not. Now, I'm getting in the weeds here, but this is what is happening right now. The Senate bill wants to end the tax exemption to data centers and put those dollars in service to people such as childcare, healthcare, education, increasing teachers' pay, reducing electric bills. However, we've got to ask, will Governor Spanberger support the people or large corporations? We're talking Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, Facebook, and each one of those companies is worth trillions of dollars. Folks, we need to come together and we need to resist. Okay. Yeah. Please, well, when you start, here's the clicker. Your slide should be next. She's gonna do one.
I forgot. So I just, I'm very sorry. I'm remiss. I meant to introduce you to the three presenters this evening. You just heard from Sharon Fisher. She's the president of the Clinch Coalition and coordinator with the Southwest Virginia Nuclear Watch Coalition and Grassroots Movement. Wally Smith, who has just arrived, is a soil and water director for Wise County with the Lonesome Pine Soil and Water Conservation District. And Jenny Turman is the associate professor of history at UVA Wise and author of the forthcoming book, The New Decentralists, The Back to the Land Movement and the Politics of Localism in Appalachia, 1968 to 2000. Now we'll hear from Juan.
I already screwed up the presentation. Let's see if I can get it pulled back up. I think that was me at least. Yeah, click through. There we go. So thank y'all. I'm sorry for coming in late. I was coming from a local government meeting down the road and ran out of there and then came over here. So I'm glad I made it in time. But as she said, my name is Wally Smith. If y'all don't know me, some of y'all may know me through my day job. So I work at UVA Wise. I'm not affiliated with some of the projects that you've been hearing about tonight through that role. I'm an ecologist and conservation biologist there. So for my day job, I study the impacts of land use policy on Appalachian ecosystems. So there's obviously a lot of overlap with what we're discussing here tonight with that. And I'm also one of your elected officials if you do live in Wise County. So I am a soil and water conservation director. A lot of folks have no idea what that means. That's totally fine because we're not really in the same plane as a board of supervisors, that kind of thing. What we actually do is we're elected to represent local citizens in conservation issues. So if you're an agricultural producer, a lot of what we do is fund programs to assist private landowners, get folks to farm with erosion issues, stormwater issues, but then also we have this role to represent y'all when a conservation issue comes up. So in addition to me talking tonight, I'm not going to tell you what to think necessarily here, but I would like to hear from y'all. I'll have some more information here in a couple of minutes that you can engage with me. And hopefully some of your other elected officials as well that have different roles in the county tonight. I will mention through that elected role that I have, even if you haven't heard about what we do, we don't have any kind of regulatory authority. So the Soil and Water Board that I sit on, we don't manage drinking water, we don't manage sewer, that's groups like the PSA. We don't make or enforce laws, so we're more of an advisory group. So when it comes to a data center, some of the other projects that I'll mention, when those come up, we don't have to approve those. So we're kind of in a weird kind of gray area when it comes to how regulations work. But part of our job is to inform decision makers when they do make those decisions. So that's kind of where my background is, where I'm coming from. But what I thought I would talk about, I know Sharon set the stage about some of the issues that we're seeing here in the region right now. I thought I would talk about kind of in the world that I work in, both with the soil and water director position and also my day job as a college professor, the idea of community engagement and public engagement, because this is something that is completely relevant. What we're talking about here tonight, when it comes to any kind of public governance work, public engagement is a really important part of that, just making sure that the public's voice, local residents' voices are heard in project planning and especially the implementation of big projects, whether it's a data center or a local park. Regardless of the topic, the public deserves a voice in some of those decisions. So I thought I would open with the image that you see here that is not mine, so I don't want to take credit for this. This actually comes from Johns Hopkins University, so it's more of a public health school slide, but I think that a lot that is shown up here speaks to how public engagement works. I know it's kind of busy, but what you're seeing here is the idea that community engagement or public engagement really is a spectrum. It's not a question of whether you're doing it or whether you're not. There are varying degrees of it. As you can see up here, going from, I guess, your left over to the right, you're looking at different degrees of public engagement that can exist, where the lowest level of public engagement over to the left, if the public is being engaged at all, is where you're simply informing as a public official or a government body what you're doing. You may not be necessarily asking for input from the public, but instead you're saying, here's a decision that we made, we're making you aware of it, and maybe if you have questions, reach out to us, that sort of approach. And then on the far right side of that spectrum is really high level of public engagement where the community itself actually leads in the decision-making process. So you're not learning about something from a press release, you're not learning about it from, a grand announcement by an elected official. Instead, you're actually involved from the ground level when those decisions are made. And you can see here as well, there's kind of shades of gray between those, where there are varying levels, various stages, where the public can be involved in any kind of public decision that's made at the local level. This also happens at the state and federal level, too. So the spectrum can hold, basically across all levels of public life and all levels of public life. So I think, maybe a good example, excuse me, or an illustration of how that can or cannot work and where we sit on the spectrum is what we saw a few years ago when some of the first announcements happened about the county and the local planning district exploring the possibility or the feasibility of locating nuclear reactors here in the region. I pulled this map from the feasibility study that came from WISCO back in 2013. And I will stress that, this map is not saying definitively that a reactor has been proposed for all those locations, but what you're seeing is the map that was produced through that feasibility study saying these are locations that were evaluated for the possible feasibility of, would it be suitable to eventually site nuclear reactors here in the region. And I bring this up because the way that a lot of us, including me, as somebody who was just starting an elected term when this all came out, the way I first found out about this was from the news. So there were no local meetings held, there was no meeting like this where the public was brought together, and any public official said, hey, as a heads up, we're exploring this is something we would like to do, we would like your input. That simply didn't happen. And that feasibility analysis really happened with no general public meetings like this. There was some input sought. There was a stakeholder survey that was performed as a part of that study, but it was very selective and exclusive, meaning that only a certain list of people were allowed to provide input for that study. And then when that came out, as y'all know, if you followed this issue back in the press a few years ago, both local and state officials at different times repeatedly claimed that public input was really unnecessary because we were just looking at the feasibility of locating nuclear energy here. But obviously, as you see back here, there's a lot else that can be done when it comes to even a basic feasibility study. So I would argue that throughout that whole process, where we were kind of sitting was over to the far left of this graph, maybe even off of the far left of that graph, where the public was informed. But a lot of those early decisions, at least when it came to the feasibility study here with nuclear, were kind of made behind closed doors, and then those decisions were handed down to the public a little bit later. And I think in a lot of ways, I missed a little bit of Sharon's remarks, but we're seeing that with data centers as well. When these decisions happen, we're learning about them through a news article, not learning about them through a general town hall meeting like this, where questions and the dialogue are allowed. So that has kind of been my concern, both as a local citizen and then also as an elected official, is can we get more public involvement, more public voice? Because I think just through the world that I work in, that's how we make better decisions. When we've got more input, we've got more people involved on the front end. That's how we find solutions to really complex problems. So just wanted to show you all kind of a quick roadmap of how I think this works, like in a perfect world, how I would love to see public engagement with any kind of decision making, whether again, it's a data center, something related to energy, even just public parks or trails, stuff that's relatively non-controversial. And that's kind of what you're seeing up here, just to walk you through this flow chart. There's always going to be an initial concept or an idea. So some individual, maybe an outside firm, may have an idea that they think could benefit the local community. And then typically in a perfect world, what you would see before any decisions were ever made is some kind of public scoping process where the question is asked, is this concept or is this idea viable? And then is it also needed? Is it something the community actually wants? Do we have consent for that here? If we do have consent, how's it going to fit into the community? And that's usually done in several ways. Kind of down below that second box, I put some of the avenues through which that usually happens with media notices, the newspaper, local television stations, radio. There's a public info meetings, just like we're doing here tonight. Ideally, you would have some kind of public official, but it's not me because I have no decision-making authority. But maybe somebody with that authority up here leading a discussion. Maybe an outside facilitator. There's folks who do that for their jobs. They can come in and facilitate those kind of discussions. And then also coupled with that, some kind of public input mechanism. So a way, even outside of a meeting like this, if you go home and you've got a question, a concern, an idea of the decision makers, having some kind of mechanism to formally get that information in front of them so it's reported and it becomes part of the project planning. That usually is the best practice for this kind of project planning that happens across a lot of the country. And then from there, kind of moving over to that third box, you've got the analysis stage where maybe the whole community is not involved initially, but what you'll have is the project leadership team, maybe some representatives from the community, like a focus group, come together, look at all that input that they got from the community, and then see, what is the community saying? What are their concerns? How do they think this would help the community? How do they think, might hurt the community? What issues may cause? And then I put a little kind of feedback loop there, because ideally what you would do is after you do that analysis, kind of refine your plan, go back to the community with it. You may have to do that several times, but as you do it, you're gradually getting more and more info that gives you a better plan. And then eventually at the end of that process, the handshake over there simply shows the decision implementation, where maybe not everybody in the community is happy with that decision, but at least they've been aware of how that decision-making process works. I think that's usually kind of the gold standard for any kind of civic planning, regardless of what the topic is. So that's what I would love to see, and that does happen with a lot of projects. Some of y'all are familiar with like the Forest Service around here and how they do projects. They go through scoping very similar to this. Just like I was saying before, not everybody agrees with the final decision that's made, but the process that lets you get there very often gives the public multiple opportunities for input and to object. The decision makers have to listen to that input, and a lot of times you can come up with a better plan than when you start when you follow that process. So that would be great. But instead, I think, kind of what we've seen here with the data center decision, a lot of the nuclear decisions up till now as well, is kind of what I've called the country club model of civic planning, where you do have maybe some scoping, you have that initial idea or project concept. There's some kind of analysis and decision-making process that happens, but I call it the country club model. That's not like an official term or anything, but when the scoping happens a lot of times under this model, the public isn't aware that there's even been an idea proposed. And instead, there's closed door meetings. It's a very secretive process where a very strategic list of stakeholders are allowed in the room and allowed to provide input. Very often here, what I've seen personally is that some elected officials, I'm often not allowed in the room. It's one of those officials. Industry VIPs, politically connected nonprofits, won't name any names, but some groups have more political connections than others. They're allowed to provide input. And then also our economic development staff, which do play a role as stakeholders, but very often that circle is drawn very tightly around those groups, and discussions happen without the public's knowledge, without those formal mechanisms for people from the community to provide their input. And then that analysis and decision is made before the public ever finds out. And like I was showing back here, all of a sudden we see headlines one day in the Cardinal News, the local newspaper, handing down this decision that no one even knows about. And that, I think, is really where a lot of the public conflict comes from. The public gets caught off guard when people say, well, wait a minute, there's going to be a nuclear reactor at site X or site Y. Even if that hasn't been formally proposed, it's a total surprise to folks if they don't know those sites to be considered. Whereas in a meeting like this, if you're hearing us talk about these kind of things in public, people at least know when they can get those ideas in front of those decision makers. So, I just bring that up to kind of point out that I think we're kind of to the far left of that spectrum that I showed y'all before, or maybe even off of that. It's a very kind of closed door situation. And something I've heard a good bit when, data centers have come up, have been public officials saying, well, we can't talk about this because we're under an NDA, a confidentiality agreement. Those do happen. I've worked under those before, but I've never seen an NDA that says you absolutely cannot talk about project blank. You're restricted from speaking about certain proprietary info, but the idea that you just can't talk to the public at all about a project is typically not something that happens. So, maybe going on here, but it would be, in my view, pretty unusual if that did. So kind of coming back to some projects, I think, where these kind of issues could be addressed with more of this approach, like I was showing back here, are the data centers, which I'll come to in just a second, because I know that's the topic of the meeting. But I want to bring up one more that could or could not be related to the data center industry. I'm not honestly sure, but it is something that's come up on my radar in the last few weeks and months. Is it a project that has not been proposed by the county? So this is not Wise County or the Wisco project. This is something that has been proposed by an outside developer, so a private company, but it kind of followed this process of coming up on folks' radar by surprise. A while back, it was actually proposed, I think in 2014, I believe, I could be getting the year wrong. But this is a pump hydro storage facility that has been preliminarily proposed and approved by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I know that's a mouthful, but basically what you want to do if you want to have a large energy project, you have to first file an application that's called a preliminary application or preliminary permit. This project right now is not moving to construction as far as I'm aware, but this initial permit went out. There was a review process. I'm sure at some point it was announced maybe in a newspaper somewhere, and I personally missed that notification. Don't think any public meetings were held, but the idea with this project would be to build a pair of reservoirs. So an upper reservoir or lake, a lower reservoir or lake. And if you know about how pumped hydro storage works, you move that water between those reservoirs, you pump it uphill to the upper reservoir, and then when it flows back down, that helps to generate electricity. So it's not nearly as concerning in terms of air quality, that kind of thing, as combustion, modes of energy generation are. But this has been proposed in the community of Rhoda, if you're familiar with it, it's just down the road, right outside of Appalachia. And I bring it up because there's a lot of potential questions and concerns that I think can be addressed through more of this kind of iterative public planning process where folks are in the room and allowed to provide input throughout the entire development process of this project. Because what it would do, based on the application that was filed, is construct those reservoirs. The Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they both expressed some serious concern about potential impacts to the Powell River from the construction of this. Looking at their comments, I would personally agree with those. So it would be wonderful to see with this kind of project, this kind of meeting happen where the public could come and express their concern. This would also be relatively close to nearby homes in Rhoda. So I think only a few hundred feet. I may have that figure, a little bit off there. But that lower reservoir that you see on this map would be relatively close to folks that live in that community. And then also, would there be cost to local ratepayers? It's not really clear if this project would serve a utility that we may be paying customers of, or if it would be what we call behind the meter generation, where this would serve something like a data center or private industry. Those are complete unknowns right now, but this is one of several projects in addition to the nuclear projects I mentioned earlier that I think this kind of more public discussion can really benefit from in terms of figuring out what this project looks like and how it can move forward. And so that brings me to the data centers. Again, obviously this is somewhere, since I've been talking about it, that I think a more publicly engaged process could really benefit. Now, I won't just rehash what's been planned for the data center complex in Wise County, because I know data centers came up as the sheriff's remarks, but basically this data center has been proposed, as far as we know from some headlines in the press and some news articles, for the Once Upon a Time Business and Tech Park, which is out near the airport, kind of between the airport and Wise County Christian School, Belton Dotson Park. That's generally the area we're talking about. As far as I'm aware, there have been no official site plans made available yet to know exactly where in the tech park the infrastructure for this data center complex would go. But what has been reported in the press is multiple data center buildings, I believe 9 maybe is the number that has been mentioned, along with some kind of gas generation facilities. They will be burning natural gas or methane to produce electricity, presumably to power these data centers. So again, when you think about that kind of project, it's in a relatively high density area for our part of the world. There's a lot of folks that live nearby. Wise County Christian School is right next door. Mountain Road Vineyards is close, where I spend most of my time at EVA Wise is right there. We've got Heritage Hall that's relatively close as well. There's a lot of different community assets that are really close to this facility. And so some of the questions that I've had as a public official, as a local resident, somebody who could be impacted by this, where I work for my day job, is how would this impact things like air quality? The data centers themselves could be a concern because we know from other data centers elsewhere in the country, there are emergency diesel generators that are used periodically at those data centers. They produce air pollution. There's particulates that come up when they do that. That can decrease air quality. So, would those be operated at these data centers? How often would they be operated? Those are still unknowns. And in addition, if we're going to have a gas plant associated with this, those are a major concern in terms of air quality, because natural gas is a great form of energy if you're going to burn it to produce electricity. But there are trade-offs with that. So there's air pollution that can come from it. Particulate generation, I won't get into the weeds too much of the technical jargon, but the particulate matter is really small particles that are released into the air. Very hard to get out of the air. There's some of the air quality treatment that we have, and if you breathe those in, there's a lot of research that has shown that can cause all sorts of health issues. These become a major public health concern when they're sited relatively close to high-density areas where folks live. And right now, it kind of varies depending on the literature source that you're looking at with what that health concern would be. But generally speaking, about a half mile to a mile from those gas plants is kind of the radius of concern that folks that are within those. Didn't put the figures up here, but I think the Christian School was just a few hundred feet from the Tech Park boundary. The Mountain Road Vineyards is very close as well. UVA Wise, the Bear Creek Meadows subdivision, those are all well within that radius. There would be a lot of potential concern there. And obviously, if we're going to move forward with this, I think we really need that public conversation so that those folks that live in that area can be informed about exactly what the plans are. I can't really make my own informed decision about some of those risks because there's just so few details that have been released other than this plan is happening and the county thinks it will be great. That's certainly their prerogative to have that approach, but we need more details to make some informed decisions about those projects. And then also, since I'm a soil and water director, water quality and quantity is a major issue because, as y'all know, data centers need water for a number of reasons, primarily to cool their infrastructure, so to cool their servers. The technology is advancing a little bit, as I understand it. I'm not an expert on that technology, but if you're not using a closed loop system, if you're pulling water from a public water source or from any natural source, running that through the server rooms, you're cooling off the servers with that water, then you're sending it back. Is that water now warmer than where it started? That's what we call thermal pollution, and that can become a concern for the environment. More concerningly, are there chemicals that are being released into that water? Can those chemicals be appropriately removed when it goes back to wherever that water source is? Again, as far as I know, we know nothing about the particular systems that this proposed data center would use, but that's information that we need, and that's information that the public needs to have a conversation about to make informed decisions, really figure out what the consequences would be for the county, both in terms of benefits and disadvantages. So right now, all really have a question mark. So going back to this slide, I really think this approach, as opposed to what we've seen so far, where these decisions kind of get handed down to us, that would really benefit our discussion of this. And I'd be happy to get more into this when we get to the Q&A in a second about some of the potential issues and more technical stuff on this side of the data set. So what I'll wrap up with, and I'll turn over to, I guess, Jenny's next in a second, is what can you do? I know it kind of feels helpless when you're looking at the situation and there's kind of this closed door, kind of very exclusive type of planning that happens with city projects. I really think the biggest thing you can do is contact your elected representatives, especially your local representatives. So if you're a county resident and you know who your representative is on the board of supervisors, you may not agree with them, they may not agree with you, but I'll guarantee they do want to hear from you. So, any kind of comment, any kind of feedback you can give them is going to be welcome. The more people they hear it from, the better they can use that decision or that information to make their decisions. And I really think specific questions, if you've got specific concerns, specific recommendations for projects, that goes a lot more way than just, or it goes a lot farther, a lot more of a way than just general statements of support or opposition. Those are important if you support or don't support a project. But, I support or don't support this project because it goes a long way and helps them take information back to their counterparts and make better decisions. So I know a lot of y'all are already doing that, so I'm preaching to the choir, but I think that's the easiest first step you can have is just to be civically engaged that way. If we're not having official meetings like this at the county government level, I think that's a great way to get your information in front of folks. And then eventually, at some point, I would presume, even with a data center project like this, there's going to have to be a public hearing held. At some point, there will be some regulatory approvals that have to happen for this kind of project. So when those do, keep an eye out, know those public meetings. It's kind of tough, and this is something I don't like about the process. A lot of times when those public meetings happen, it's too late to really get involved in the early levels of planning. But you can still get involved at those levels. So if that's the only public meeting you get, make sure to go to those, provide input. If there is some kind of scoping, if a permit is applied for, there's an opportunity for the public to comment, do that. Reach out and provide your comment through that official medium, especially through that official medium. It's important because, social media comments are important as well, but those won't go into the official document of record when that planning happens. So I think, knowing those avenues is really important. And that's something I can help with. One of my jobs, and it actually says this in the director's input that we have when we get elected, is when those projects happen, if there's a nexus there, if there's an overlap with soil and water impacts, somebody like me is supposed to go to those meetings and provide comment. I'm supposed to file written comments through that process. So absolutely provide your own comments, but I would love to hear from y'all as well, whether you support or don't support a project. If you've got specific concerns you would like me to echo and me to convey when those opportunities come up, please let me know. My contact information is up here. I would love to hear about you all. Anytime, even if it's another issue beyond data centers, feel free to reach out. And also know just what your regulatory processes are going to be. Who has to approve a project? So I mentioned FERC back here, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That was one of the reasons I wanted to share this project, is there is kind of a prescribed process that projects like this have to follow. So, knowing who the appropriate group is, who the appropriate body is, has to approve something, I think is critical. And then knowing when through the life of that project that those approvals occur, that can also kind of help you be prepared when those opportunities arise to provide comments that will be most impactful, or whatever concerns you have, whatever your needs are, getting those in front of those groups, I think is really critical. So I will shut up after that. Hopefully I haven't rambled too much and turn it over to Jenny. Again, if y'all do have questions in the Q&A in a few minutes, I'm more than happy to take those, and I'll stick around once we get to that. But thank y'all.
Okay, I think we're all carrying our water up here because we've been talking about the pollen is so bad right now that, yeah, we're kind of coughing a little bit. So, thank you all so much for having me. I'm Jenny Turman. I am a history professor at UVA-Wise, and I actually do specialize in Appalachian history and modern U.S. history. And one of my areas of interest is activism and social movements, which by default means you also have to understand something about how local governments work as well. And so what I wanted to talk about, I think I was looking at Wally's fabulous slides, and mine are not fabulous. They're really sort of run of the mill, but he did get me thinking about this question of civic engagement. And that is something that I'm going to dive into a little bit. So that's going to be part of it, and then I'm also going to just sort of map out a very, very brief history of Appalachia during and after the industrial period to show you all how this limited decision-making, limited transparency, and sort of focusing on one particular economic development plan has sort of transcended centuries. So we can even date that back to really the 1890s. So I'll get into that a little bit. So you all see the title of my particular presentation is why data centers appear to be the only option, right? This is what we hear, that we don't have anything else. We've got to bring them in. That's our tax revenue. We're losing coal, right? There's this kind of narrative. Of course, if you listen to state officials, if you listen to federal officials, it's all AI. It's got to be AI. It's got to be data centers. This is it, right? There's not talk of. I keep joking with my partner about like back in the when we watch cartoons, the Jetsons. Like, where are the flying cars? Right? We're supposed to be having flying cars now, right? There's supposed to be all this innovation, and now we just have AI, and it's like the only thing. So why is that? So they are creating the appearance of this being the only thing. And that's one thing I really want to impart upon you all is that I keep mentioning when I go to the Board of Supervisors and I speak, I talk about, so I live here in Big Stone, and I talk about all the really interesting things that all of the towns are doing to diversify their economies, but I don't hear that coming from the Board of Supervisors. So there seems to be a disconnect there as well, even if you look at your town councils and what they're trying to do. It's a little bit different than what the Board of Supervisors may be suggesting. So with that, okay, I told you my slides aren't fancy. But as any good historian would do, there is a wonderful array of scholarship out there. If you all want to learn more, and a couple of these works I am going to draw from in this presentation, but there's just this fabulous body of excellent research out there. So one of the things that I really want to impart, and I am talking sort of generals here, I'm not talking specifically about our Board of Supervisors, but these historians and political scientists and sociologists, and there's even a journalist up there, what they have kind of found and argued is that the coal fields in particular, and it's not solely unique to here, but we do tend to have what people would refer to as oligarchic governments, right? They tend to pass on power through families, right? We can all identify a few names that probably appeared back in the Board of Supervisors in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, and maybe even the 1870s, I don't know, but power tends to get passed on. These are landowners. They may have access to a lot of resources in the county. They may be party to development that comes from higher state levels. They've got connections to people in state seats of power, right, in Richmond or in Lexington or in Charleston, West Virginia. And so it's not to say, again, that they're exclusively that way or things haven't changed over time. But there does seem to be a tendency, as Wally mentioned, that they assume that they can make decisions, right, outside of the view of the public, right? That there are decisions that tend to be made maybe behind closed doors, and then they present us with the option, right? One option, or maybe not so great second option. So a lot of that decision making, those tendencies, those oligarchic tendencies, date back. One of the books up there, The Road to Poverty, they dated back to settlement, European settlement in Eastern Kentucky. There are families in certain counties that have basically passed on power over and over and over again through the generations, and you can still find them in power now, right? So there are these political systems in place who do tend to see themselves as being, right, the appropriate people to make decisions about the economic development of their county. And that may or may not have benefit for the rest of the citizens. Sometimes it can, sometimes it doesn't, right? It may generally benefit them in their own particular interests. The other thing that I really want to mention, really want to emphasize, is when we look at industrialization, the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and especially that period where we saw the map of land ownership that shared, right, what 20% is actually in like public, you know, in the open market, the rest is federal or Penn, Virginia or something. So that dates back to that industrialization period where the narrative goes that outside coal interests bought up this land. But you have to sit there and ask yourself also, who was here on the ground that helped them do that, right? So we tend to think of like, yes, people in Philadelphia or New York or Texas or Northern Virginia now, as the case may be. And they certainly are a big part of that. But they also needed to have lawyers who were on the ground. They needed to have landowners who were on the ground. They needed to have people who knew other people, right, locally, who could get them access to purchasing coal mineral rights and gas rights and that kind of thing. So it's really important not to overlook the local power structure and the role that they played in the industrialization process and sowing the seeds of the conditions that we're dealing with now. So I just wanted to kind of mention that. I can say more about that maybe in the Q&A. So I do want to talk about one book up here that is especially important to understanding how these local political systems work and how they operate in such a way to kind of perpetuate their power and control over economic decision making. And that's the one that would be on your left, Power and Powerlessness by John Cuventus. Some of you may actually be familiar with it. He is actually on a new book tour of Appalachia right now. So if you get to catch him, he was in West Virginia, he's in Kentucky, at UK. And so don't miss the chance, if you can, to listen to him. But this book is, it dates to 1982. So, but it has stood the test of time. And I'll just recap as best I can some of his points about his observations about how county governments and local governments kind of operated to limit the options that were available to residents. And I'm not going to test you on this. If you need to go, you can go over it again later. I can. He's got like what he calls 3 dimensions of power. So 3 mechanisms through which local governments can wield power over their constituents. The first dimension is pretty straightforward. Elites are able to wield power and make decisions that affect their communities because they're politicians, right? They've got connections, they've got money, they've got resources, they've got lawyers, they know people in Richmond, right? I mean, this is just basically, if any of us get elected to office, we're going to have people on the phone who may not listen to us otherwise, right? This is how politics works. So it's pretty straightforward. There also may be in more rural communities, there may be name prestige. I know my folks come from Floyd and Patrick County. I remember my grandma talking about the local people. They were from a good family because they were involved in politics, right? So you just kind of knew, right? And she probably deferred to those people to some extent. The second dimension of power, then, he suggests that elites can actually, and this is what get to Wally's point, they can skew or limit economic development options and alternatives that are presented to the public as viable choices. So these are the kinds of decisions that go on behind closed doors, right? That they'll be on the phone with some company in Texas or some politician in Richmond or Washington. And basically these kinds of conversations take place out of the public eye. So yeah, by the time that the public hears about it, there's already pretty good investment going on. They've already done siting surveys and all that kind of stuff. And so what they present to the public basically is, well, this is the thing, right? This is the thing you all are going to have. This is what Gaventa refers to as the mobilization of bias towards one particular type of industry or one particular type of development. What's interesting is in the second dimension of power, they can also use other tactics to mobilize public opinion towards that if they face opposition. So for instance, they might say to somebody at the Board of Supervisors meeting, oh, well, you're just paid protesters. So basically what they're doing is trying to turn people's opinion against, right, turn the public's opinion against people who might oppose them. So that's mobilizing bias, right? So that's kind of how that works as well. This can also include more dramatic measures. So if all else fails, the county I study in West Virginia, unfortunately, had intimidation threats, threat of burning down people's homes. I mean, it can actually take more extreme measures in certain cases, red baiting, that kind of thing. Then there's the third dimension of power, which is when I learned this, it was a lot more difficult for me to wrap my head around. But basically, Gaventa suggests that elites benefit from social and psychological relationships that they develop within their communities or within their institutions, as the case may be, because I think Gaventa was also looking at the UMWA hierarchy in the 1970s, which had some rocky points over leadership, a lot of conflict over leadership. And so what he found when he was looking very closely at these power dynamics was that people in power could often sort of, I won't say manipulate, but because of the relationships they had with people who were maybe under them in some way, people would, their constituents would basically just say, okay, yeah, we're going to give you power over decision making just because of who you are. And you are the decision maker. We will maybe relegate our own interests. You know what's best, right? I mean, these kind of come from personal relationships. And I think all of us can identify if you think about just interpersonal relationships, And so for a good example here, within the coal fields, observers like Gaventa, but others, have often described, and apologies to my medievalist colleague, because he's going to get mad at me for saying this, but they have often described coal field politics, especially in the early 20th century, as feudal or medieval. Mother Jones said, medieval West Virginia, right? That's a famous line. And she's describing basically a system of power where the people in power act like nobility, right? They almost act like lords over everybody else. And so it's that sort of profound, extensive, almost unrecognizable if you're living in it, right? System of power. So I just wanted to give that overview because he lays this out very, very clearly in his research. But this is something to think about. It's a useful model, I think, when we think, we're interacting with a board of supervisors that may or may be more or less accommodating to public input, right? And so do with that information what you will, but I find it somewhat helpful here. So, okay, so just to move on then, how does this actually play out then? If we trace, this is a very brief history here, but I've got just a couple of image slides to show you all. So if we're going to go back to industrialization and trace, look kind of forward through industrialization to the 1950s, to the 1970s, to the 80s and 90s and 2000s. Basically what we see is more or less there is one option, right? There's one option being presented. It's coal. It's a different type of mining of coal. By the 70s, there's a little bit of diversification in the coal fields, but then it's coal again with the energy boom. And then in the era of globalization, things start to change. And so we get a different set of narratives about what is necessary, right, for economic development. So that's what kind of where I'm going here. Of course, 1890s to 1920s, it's resource extraction. It's railroads. In order to build the railroads, you've got to have timber, and in order to mine coal, you have to have timber. So we've got a combination of coal development and timber development. Timber, of course, also shapes Western North Carolina and other non-coal producing places, but they have their own versions of mining as well, mica, that kind of thing. So everything from the legal system, the mechanism of the legal system to allow for corporate development changes. We go from an agricultural system that favored farmers and landowners to then a legal system that benefits corporations. I didn't put Ronald Lewis's work up there, but he's another historian who's written about this legal revolution in Utah that really reshaped Appalachia's economy in the 1880s and 1890s. And so, of course, if you all know anything about your history of feuds, right, Hatfield and McCoys and other feuds in Eastern Kentucky, a lot of it actually was over control of resources during this really, it's not about a hog. It's actually about the control of resources in places like Eastern Kentucky and the Tug Fork Valley, which is what's pictured here. Who's going to come out on top, right? Which lawyers, which landowners? They're all sort of middling, right, people, intermediaries in this larger process of economic development. And that's not to say, again, that we don't have people from outside who are very much party to this. So that I don't want to neglect that point. But these local officials, local intermediaries, or business owners, lawyers, landowners, they all play a role in this as well to try to come out on top in this dramatically changing environment. And so if you're a local farmer here in 1890, you're being told coal is the thing, right? Coal is the one thing. You can harvest your timber, but it's all going to be about coal, right? That's basically what people would have been hearing at the time. And they talk about this as being inevitable, right? The march of progress. It's inevitable. This is going to happen. So don't stand in the way. Any naysayers, right, would have potentially gotten hurt or got pushed out or faced other repercussions. Okay, so then of course I do want to mention also. So I end this up in the 1920s because this is World War I. We're mining a lot of coal, and then all of a sudden, right, we put the brakes on. There's too much coal that's mined. And actually, portions of the coal fields end up in depression before the depression hits. So things are already kind of hard through the 1920s. And of course, through the 1930s, things get really bad for coal field residents and elsewhere. So there isn't really much in terms of economic development proposals going on. But we do see the federal government starting to intervene with various types of wage labor and infrastructure jobs and that kind of thing. So moving on then, of course, coal does revive. It revives especially during World War II, which I've talked to folks who lived in Northern Appalachia, and the towns are just booming, right? This is sort of the heyday of this area. They've got movie theaters, they've got recreation, they've got just shopping, shopping, clothes and cars, auto shops, the whole bit. And it looks like things are going to be really good. Ronald Eller is also up on that list of books who wrote Uneven Ground, Appalachia, post 45 America. He talks about this period, World War II, basically as a missed opportunity, right? He refers to it as growth without development. And so we're going to grow, and it's going to look like everything is really taken off and it's awesome. But then politicians at the local level fail to take it and then reinvest and diversify the economy. So West Virginia and Chemical Valley is kind of the same thing. Portions of Eastern Kentucky, anywhere you have ordnance factories, like there's this missed moment because politicians, again, are like, they're going to do the one thing they're used to doing that they know is going to be a sure bet or they think is going to be a sure bet. So here it's coal. So we're going to stick with coal. We're not going to reinvest, or we're not going to think that maybe coal someday might not be what, might not be pulling in money that it once was. So then we get to 1951. Some of you may actually remember this. I don't know. Or remember the fallout from this is that when we think about coal, we also have to think about the process of mechanization. When I think about data centers, my brain goes to AI, right? I'm a knowledge worker, I'm a professor, and I'm sitting here wondering what AI is going to do to people like me in my profession later on. Maybe we're going to be irrelevant. I don't know. I look at mining mechanization, and we got an example of what can happen, right? There was an agreement between John L. Lewis, who's there in the picture, sitting in the center there, the head of the UMWA, negotiating with the Coal Operators Association, and it sounded good. I mean, what he did was good. He agreed to allow for mechanization so we could have a system of hospitals, healthcare benefits that miners really needed. Right. It was a very important piece of legislation, but he also knew it was a devil's bargain, right? Because mechanization is going to result in job loss. And very quickly then, mechanization, the one thing, so it's inevitable, it's the thing we've got to do. But of course, by 1960, right, our population starts to decline. And so you see a mass exodus of young people and working families going up to Cleveland and Cincinnati and Detroit and other places. This even does affect farming Appalachia. My dad is an out migrant. My mom was an out migrant. So there are other things going on as well. But mining mechanization being presented as the one thing, of course, doesn't also lead to sort of permanent economic redevelopment, right? So fast forward then, I don't want to talk too much longer, but fast forward again, we get to the 1970s. This is after the war on poverty. And the war on poverty did lead to some economic development, diversification. I think, again, I don't know Wise County all that well, but I think there were a few factories here, maybe garment factories and things like that back in the 70s, 60s, 70s. Didn't tend to last terribly long. The county I studied in West Virginia, same thing. They actually had a brassiere factory. Shoes, that kind of thing. But again, despite a little bit of diversification by 1973, 74, 75, 76, the nation needs energy. It needs a domestic energy source. And so again, you've got this sort of reinforcement in local politicians' mind that it's got to be all about coal. And so that again, it kind of entrenches, right, the status quo. Is coal is it, right? It's the lifeblood. This is what we're going to stick with. And then, of course, they move away from those conversations about economic diversification. And so when we get into the 1980s to 2000s, this is where things get really bad, right? Just across the country, right? I think we all remember NAFTA. I actually grew up in Hickory, North Carolina, the furniture capital, and man, did it get hit. I was initially in textiles before I became a historian. That also got hit. And so across the country, deindustrialization, offshoring of industry just hit communities really hard. It hit first in the north, but certainly southern communities and coalfield communities also got hit really hard. And the way to think about that in the coalfield specifically is, of course, we do mining mechanization sort of translates to surface mining, and surface mining is a function basically to, the argument is to compete with cheaper coal coming from India and China, right? So we've got to mine coal as cheaply as possible because of this overseas competition. So what it also looked like for a lot of coalfield communities, jobs have dried up, populations have declined, and then all of a sudden the one thing becomes call center. We have a call center here, but Amazon there outside of Huntington, West Virginia, which unfortunately I think is going to close in May. So again, not a permanent form of development. It was a stopgap measure in this process of globalization where local officials working in conversation with state and federal determined that these, that were fundamentally lower wage jobs, right, were going to be what would fill the gap and what would lead Appalachia into the future. So I do want to read a quote here really quickly. Try to do this just from the side. But this is from Ron Eller's Uneven Ground, and this is what he says about this period. Rather than focusing civic energies on the improvement of housing, higher education, culture, recreation, and health facilities that would enhance the quality of life for local workers and encourage creativity and entrepreneurship, leaders continued, again, it's going back to this history that I've talked about, continued to look to external models of development that perpetuated old dependencies on outside markets and absentee capital. Right. So this is really, again, what we're looking at now, the situation we have in Wise County and other communities, is the same pattern, right? You have local politicians who don't consult their constituents, they don't ask, they don't run surveys, they don't field input, and then they determine what is ultimately they think good for us, right? Good for the community. So it really is kind of the same situation. It may look a little different now because it's less about call and more about data centers or something else, but it is grafting onto that energy tradition, that energy history. So, okay, the last thing I have here. So I'm going to try to be like Wally. I'm a historian. We tend to look back on the past, like, and not think too much about the future necessarily, but I do want to end on an upbeat note because I have learned some things by studying activism and just knowing a little bit about different counties. And I think one of the things I do want to recommend to you all is look at other communities and what their political structures and systems and practices look like, because it's not all that far down the road from us that there is an economic development authority, and I'm not saying Floyd County is perfect by a long shot, but if you read that statement from Floyd County and compare it to our economic development authority, you can see that they have much more consideration. It's a more open government, right? More consideration of sort of the well-being of the community, fostering innovation, soliciting ideas and business energy and input from their constituents. They run surveys of the county residents all the time and field input from them. So whereas we look at Wise County and the vision, an abundant natural resource base consisting of all these resources, coal, gas, timber. These attributes make the county an ideal location for manufacturing, information technology, distribution, logistics, energy production, and data center operations right there at the end. Whereas, again, Floyd County talks about growth through startups, expansion, attraction of businesses, and fundamentally, they're concerned about preserving a good quality of life for their constituents. So they have there at the end preserving community character, growing within our resource capacity, preserving, respecting natural and agricultural resources. It just sounds a lot like they have a bit more concern for a very diverse economy and for encouraging small businesses in particular that, when you think about a small business, and I will stop here in a second, what you end up having, right, are people who start businesses, potentially can pass it on to their heirs, right? Those businesses could grow, change over time, and they get rooted in the community, and the money comes back into the community. It doesn't go to Richmond, right, or it doesn't go to Texas or wherever. So it's just, I want to encourage you all. This is my last slide here. Just a couple of things to think about, lessons as I've done research in the region that I think are important. Certainly become familiar with these patterns of anti-democratic behavior. Get to know them. If you are part of an organization or you have enough money, you can subscribe to newspaper databases that make research really easy, and you can do very quick and easy keyword searches to find out is there something of a pattern among our board of supervisors or among certain politicians where they have acted this way previously? And I'm just going to give you a little hint that in the 1990s, there are some things that sound really familiar to this situation we're facing now, even a tax issue. So, just kind of become familiar with that history. I think it is useful and helpful in giving you kind of the framework and the language for calling out patterns, because that's going to help you challenge, right? Those tendencies, those anti-democratic tendencies. Also question those narratives of inevitability. Is AI really inevitable? Are data centers inevitable? No, you can look across America right now and see all kinds of resistance to them in rural communities, urban communities. So, and as a historian, nothing is inevitable. It sounds like it because we're looking back at the past, but nothing is inevitable. There's always capacity for change. Organize locally, so make sure that you do attend the meetings and you do work with different organizations. Focus on the local, but also stay connected to those broader networks, especially if they're sharing a similar concern. Stay in communication with them. With Sharon's list of all of the entities, sometimes higher levels of government can be a problem, but sometimes they can also offer solutions, especially if we don't, legislation might be pending. This might be a really advantageous moment to get on the phone and call Richmond or call our elected officials. And the last thing, I'm saying this as much for myself as I am for anyone else, but stay engaged. Make sure you're mentoring young leaders as well. Encourage young people to stay here if they can, they're able. It's really important. And hold out hope that you will be able to shape decision making into the future. So I will stop there.
Standing up is different. Thank you all. Okay, we had on the table out in the hall, you had an opportunity to write down any questions. I imagine that during these 3 presentations, questions have also occurred to you. So Jane is in the back. Do you have your microphone? Because I've got one up here if you want. Has anybody got a written question that you want one of the panel to address? Jane will come by and pick that up. Or if questions have occurred to you, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and Jane will bring the microphone to you so that you have a chance to ask your questions. If you have concerns that you want to voice at this time, please share those as well. Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome, and folks are working on them.
Okay. Oh, that's sweet. The first part that I am going to read is, thank you all, excellent presentation. Thank you, that's very kind of you. Okay, I have a question here. What do you think about the 5 ultra billionaires that want to dominate the world, maybe through AI? What do you think about that? And the 5 ultra billionaires that.
Can you read the question again?
What do you think about the 5 ultra billionaires who want to dominate the world, maybe using AI? Jenny just spit it right.
I'll just echo what I said before, that nothing is inevitable. It is very important to make it a daily mantra that nothing is inevitable, and there is tremendous power in the people.
In the coalition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sharon?
Yeah, we haven't talked about AI tonight. And one of the myths is, and we actually were in a meeting where people said, or they were asked, how many of you use Facebook? How many of you use the internet? How many of you watch Netflix? See, you're all dependent upon data centers. And our society is. But the data centers we've had since maybe even the 90s, the internet certainly took care of most of that. What AI is doing, and the onrush to bring in more and more and more data centers, and not like the one at Mineral Gap, but we're talking, they call them hyperscale data centers. And there needs to be clusters of them. That's one of the reasons they like rural areas. They're moving into our land. But AI is perpetuating this onrush of more and more data centers. Now, I'm sure we all have different opinions about AI, and there are good things we hear about in science and medicine and the way AI can help, but we also know there can be downsides in many, many ways. So what we need to understand is it's AI that is now creating this onrush of data centers. And I will just tell you my personal, what has driven me to participate. We're not going to stop the global nuclear industry, and we're not going to stop data centers. But if we feel that data centers and nuclear energy should not be here on our land, using our water, and bringing in even more polluting energies, then we can stop it here.
I'll piggyback off of something she said. I think she mentioned something really important when that comment was made about, how many of you use Facebook, how many of you use the internet. It's never really said explicitly, but the implication with that is, well, you have no business talking about concerns with AI because you use the internet or you use, AI for something. I think that comes to something that might be stealing some of Jenny's thunder here with the history of the region, is that, over and over again, and I've heard this throughout my career, I work in the environmental field, so people will say, you care about the environment, so you don't want to see the county succeed economically. And that's not the case at all. I live here, I'm a resident, I don't want to see the county crash and burn economically. So I think a lot of times we're presented with this false dichotomy of, either you care about the environment or you love AI. And there's no, middle ground. Middle ground may not be the best word, but, finding that nuance and having those conversations about, well, yeah, we're probably in a world now where AI is not going away, but that doesn't mean we should just set aside all of our environmental concerns when somebody wants to build a data center. I think it's really important not to fall into that trap when we hear folks in positions of power telling us to ignore our concerns because, there's economic benefits with a certain project. That makes sense. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there's not just an either or type of situation that we have to deal with in any kind of industry. We have to ask critical questions about it.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say that is an excellent example of mobilization of bias to a strategy. It's one or the other, right? Those are the choices we have.
Mhm.
So the other thing I'll say really quickly is that I think when I say that there seems to be a lot of sort of citizen and civic concern right now and pushback to data centers, but also to AI generally, that we are kind of in a moment where I think there are, and it's taking some time, but some federal officials who are starting to recognize the need to put guardrails up around the use of AI. Certainly there's a lot of concern about the weaponization of AI and mass surveillance and all that kind of stuff. So if you think about that particular conversation as being one part of the conversation that people, in communities have about what is it going to do to our land base, what is it going to do to, are people going to want to move here if we have data centers, So I think there is a lot to kind of tap into that may actually lead to some positive legislation. So I am trying to be hopeful about that.
And to the billionaires, they can put it in space, which is one of the suggestions they're making.
I've read that. And the same question, Card has, and you've, I think, addressed this to a certain extent, the threats to the existence of humanity that these data centers present. And with that, anyone who has been following AI is aware of the effects on air and water and our environment, just to name a few. Would you please explain for us what heat domes or heat islands are? Because that's another component of AI that our audience may not be as aware of because it doesn't get the exposure that the others get.
You want me to take that one? That sounds like a nerd question, so I'm happy to answer that. So I grew up in the North Georgia mountains. I didn't grow up in Wise County. I've lived here for about 15 years. And I mentioned that because long before data centers were a thing, the city of Atlanta was really known as a heat island because when you got, in that case, a lot of what we call impervious surfaces, but concrete and asphalt, that kind of thing. You don't have a forest, you don't have natural land cover that can absorb some of that heat, then, emit it more slowly. That heat gets trapped, and then you have this local area that's a lot warmer than the surrounding environment. There's a study, I think, just the last week or two that has come out, looking at data centers and that role that they're playing, because especially like in Northern Virginia, where you've got a whole bunch of these clustered together, they do have concrete, they do have some of those materials that can hold heat, but they're emitting a lot of heat because of just the simple, electrical power they're using, the servers that they're using. So that can increase the local temperature around those data centers, and that has impacts on plant life, animal life, air quality. If it's big enough, even weather. Places like the city of Atlanta can actually influence the weather patterns there. So there's kind of a Pandora's box there if you start changing that long term, what that can mean for the local area. So that's kind of where that comes from with data centers. It's more the heat they're emitting, and if you cluster them all in a given area, what is that going to do, to the local temperature patterns, which is obviously a huge concern. Thankfully, we're not there yet. We just have the one data center out near the tech park. But if you start clustering a lot together, I don't know what the threshold is for some of those studies where you start to have points of concern, but it would definitely be something, the long-term horizon for us if we become a big center for those.
And Sharon, correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't Brian Phelan, during his presentation, not this past Board of Supervisors meeting, but the one prior to it, didn't he say something about the plan is for 9 buildings at Elam Farms with the gas generators for each one? So with that kind of concentration of data centers, the heat issue is going to become exponentially larger and extend farther out.
And what really worries me about, the gas plant approach is the heat. And then also, like I mentioned in my remarks, that particulate matter that's released, that's a huge concern. Whether it's a gas plant associated with a data center or just a plain old gas plant, there's trade-offs with that kind of energy generation. If we're putting those not out in some far-flung place, but behind a subdivision, next to a school, there's all sorts of potential issues there. That kind of concerns me that we're maybe being a little naive about that, I think, right now as a county, assuming that there's not going to be serious issues that come out of that. We've got to have those conversations. And as far as I've seen right now, we're not having those, at least at the public level. We're just kind of, moving along and not raising those concerns.
Sir?
We're from North Virginia. We're around a lot of data centers. You don't have enough water here for 9. You don't have enough water for nuclear, small reactor.
Right.
Because you have runoff comes off a small reactor. It has to go somewhere. You don't have that in these pictures I'm looking at. The sites that you have here, it won't work.
Thank you.
Because
Thank
you
you.
have one in Maryland, you have runoff, you have to get water out of Potomac,
Right.
you have to have water. This stuff talking about getting water from Wise, it's not going to work.
Welcome
It's
to
not
our
going to work. Sorry, that's what you need to tell these people. It's
Well,
not going to work.
I'll drive
You don't have enough water.